みんなで日本を変えるんだ、そんな思いで参政党コールよろしくお願いいたします。アンチの皆さんも一緒にやっていいですよ。いきますよ、せーの、1、2、参政党。
Imagine a politician in world history with the following background: an electrifying public speaker with undeniable charisma, failure at almost all academic or career endeavors prior to becoming a politician, such as being rejected by schools or not being able to pass exams, failure in running a business, etc. Conducting anti-Semitic remarks in order to gain applause and support from the general public. We could go on and on and on, but by now, you likely know exactly who we are alluding to. The one politician who will come up in your mind when hearing all of such descriptions will be none other than, well, the you-know-who. We are not going to be directly mentioning his name as the YouTube algorithm doesn't take kindly to it. But with that said, there's a contemporary political figure in Japan who also exactly fits into every one of such descriptions. And in fact, this Japanese politician just recently had one of the biggest victories in his political career, with his political party, Sansei-to, winning 14 seats in the 2025 House of Councilors election. And this politician is Kamiya Sōhei, the founder and Secretary General of Sansei-to, a conservative political party in Japan that leans towards the right or the far right side of the political spectrum. Whether Sansei-to should be identified as a right-wing or a far right-wing party remains a deeply contentious issue. Many in Japan vehemently oppose the far-right label whenever the party is described as such, mainly by the Western media or by his domestic critics within Japan. However, as we'll explore in today's video, some of the statements that Kamiya or his other party colleagues have made, as well as some of the party's proposed policies, if actually considered in depth, raise fundamental questions regarding the idea that Sansei-to can just be nonchalantly described as a moderate conservative political force. But with that said, if you venture into the Japanese side of YouTube, you'll find overwhelming support for Sansei-to's electoral success. Kamiya is widely praised for his perseverance, with congratulatory comments just absolutely dominating the discourse. In fact, we are yet to find one video from a Japanese news channel where the prevailing sentiment in the comment section on Kamiya and his party's recent election result is a one of negativity. So then the question has to be asked: who exactly is Kamiya Sōhei, and how did he and his political party gain such a surge of support in Japan in the recent phase with their slogan, Japanese First? Let us find out in today's video. Now, the reason why I'd love to cover more videos on Japanese politics if given the chance is because that's actually what I studied back in university. So for me, diving into Japan's political landscape isn't just a casual interest. It's something I've spent years studying from the ground up, mostly as an inevitability, to get the grace to graduate, or to admire Professor Tanaka's luscious gray hair during the lectures. Shout out to Professor Tanaka. He was such a down-to-earth professor with an impeccable fashion sense to add to that. As in, he would even come and smoke with the students after class in the smoking room, and he legitimately looked like a middle-aged GQ model while doing so. But anyways, school is by far from the only place where you learn throughout your time in Japan. I've learned just as much, if not more, about life from working in Japan. From working at a restaurant part-time, washing dishes, and running the cash register, doing midnight to dawn construction jobs, or working at a Japanese company after graduation. But was all the learning smooth sailing? Absolutely not. There was no one to guide me, no manual. I stumbled, I messed up, I hurt others, I hurt myself, and I ultimately learned, always the hard way. So when I reflect back on my decade-plus years of living in Japan, one thought always comes to my mind. I just wish someone had been there to guide me through the ins and outs of the country instead of me bashing my head in every time and learn everything in the most painful way. Whether it was building meaningful friendships or even something as intimate and vulnerable as dating, I made countless mistakes simply because I did not understand the unique Japanese way of thinking. So with the support of Helen, I embarked on the journey of writing a book that will be the most thorough and honest dive into the inner workings of the Japanese psychology that has ever been published. so that people who wish to either later come to Japan and start their life here, or just wish to genuinely bond and interact with individuals from Japan in general, could do so in the most successful fashion without all the trial and error that I had to experience. We actually first started our YouTube channel as there was no way for us to advertise our book at the beginning, leading us to think that YouTube was the best way to do so. But after receiving much support from you guys, thank you all so much for your support, as this would not have been possible without you guys have turned into full-time YouTubers. But then again, I will always consider the secrets of the Japanese mind as my life's work, where I grinded my soul into writing, the work that I will always be the most proud of for the rest of my life. So please check out our book, you guys. I can confidently guarantee that it will be the single best Japan-related investment that you will ever make in your lifetime and help you understand the mindset of the average Japanese individual like nobody else will. And with the purchase of our book, you will automatically be sent of our priority email address as well, where you can ask me any in-detail questions, with me responding within 48 hours. Thank you. Now back to the video. Kamiya Sōhei was born in 1977 in the coastal town of Takama, Japan. And after graduating from high school, he attended Kansai University and graduated from the Department of General Humanities. His first job after university was as a part-time lecturer at a school back in his hometown. He confessed in an interview that he was initially rejected by the school numerous times, but was able to eventually persuade them that he could teach English for the high school students based on his prior experiences of studying English in Canada for a few months. And a year later, in 2002, he became the store manager of his family business that was previously ran by his parents, the Kamiya store, which was a local supermarket that operated in his hometown of Takama. However, it seemed like operating a business was not his forte, as the supermarket eventually went bankrupt in a few months' time. Now, it is indeed debatable of whether the supermarket's failure is entirely his fault though, as the store was allegedly already going under by the time Kamiya took over the business. This led him to return as a high school lecturer in 2003. However, in 2004, he quit his job at the high school and enrolled in Kansai University Law School's legal professional training course in the hopes of eventually pursuing a legal career, earning a Juris Doctor in 2007. It seems like he has studied diligently over the years to become a lawyer, as he began studying for the Japanese National Bar exam all the way back from 2002 when he became the store manager of his family business. But he was unfortunately not able to become a licensed lawyer in spite of a law school degree, as he could not pass the Japanese National Bar exam despite taking it for a number of times. So with being a high school teacher, business owner, or a lawyer all turning out to not be his thing, there was another career path that he now turned his sight towards: politics. He ran for the Sita City Council in the 2007 local elections and was elected as councillor. He was then re-elected in 2011. But Kamiya was a man of ambition. He resigned from his Sita City Council seat in order to have a go at the 2012 Japanese general elections as a member of the Liberal Democratic Party. However, he had to taste defeat this time as he lost in the elections against Nishino Koichi from the Japan Restoration Party. He once again made an attempt to return to politics by running for the Osaka Prefectural Assembly in the 2015 local elections, but was thoroughly defeated by finishing dead last, 6th place out of the 6 candidates. At this point, most would have walked away from politics entirely, but Kamiya had other plans. In March 2020, he co-founded a new political party, Sanseitou, and took on the role of Secretary General. And fast forward to merely a few years later, in 2025, Sanseitou shocked the Japanese political establishment by winning 14 additional seats in the House of Councillors election, bringing their total to 15. So as of this point in time of creating this video, Kamiya Sōhei, the failed supermarket manager who ran his parents' business into bankruptcy, or at least could not stop it from happening, the law school graduate who could not pass the bar, the once dismissed Sita City Councilman who placed dead last in the 2015 local elections, now stood as one of the most influential figures in Japanese national politics as of 2025. Now, the internet seems to be very much divided when it comes to the people's opinion on Kamiya Sōhei and his rising political party, Sanseitou. on the western side of the internet is often portrayed as the face of a far-right, ultra-nationalist movement, a man pushing anti-immigration rhetoric, vaccine skepticism, and conspiracy-laden worldviews. To many outside of Japan, Kamiya seems like yet another populist voice in an era defined by political polarization. But shift over to the Japanese side of the internet, and the picture looks very different. You'll see that the majority actually see him not as an extremist, but merely as an honest truth-teller, a voice of reason standing up to the powerful, unaccountable elites of the Liberal Democratic Party, a party that has ruled Japan virtually unchallenged for decades. And for them, Kamiya is not some dangerous figure. He's the necessary voice of reason that Japan needs right now. So what exactly is the answer? Is he an ultra-conservative opportunist, exploiting the Japanese people's fears during the nation's harder times? Or is he the bold reformer Japan needs, one of the few politicians willing to talk about the problems everyone else seems to ignore, or at least refuse to tackle head-on? To keep our video as balanced as possible, we'll first explore what Kamiya Sōhei is doing right, how he's built a firm political base, connected with voters, and positioned himself as a political outsider, legitimately shaking up the system. Then we'll dive into the controversies, the criticisms, and some of the genuine concerns surrounding his rhetoric, worldview, and his party's long-term intentions. There's one thing that we just have to give it to Kamiya Sōhei, and we're frankly unsure of why more people are actually not talking about this. He's a remarkably gifted, deeply charismatic public speaker. Imagine yourself as an ordinary Japanese voter. You've grown accustomed to the soft-spoken, cautious tone of the Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru.
先ほど麻生元総裁、菅元総裁、岸田元総裁、お三方にお越しをいただき、私と森山幹事長でお話をさせていただきました。
Then you hear this guy.
多くの日本人の仲間に我々の思いと皆さんの思いを伝えてください。
His voice is coarse, commanding, and just, filled with testosterone, and these speeches themselves are fiery and emotional. I mean, just look at those tanned forearms, bro, and the raw sweat on his forehead. That's just something that you simply don't see in Japanese politics. And let's be honest, if Kamiya was yet another conventional, predictable Japanese politician with a measured, standard bureaucratic language, there is absolutely no way that he would have ever risen to where he stands today and received the degree of support that he's currently getting from the people. Whether the ideas that he espoused lean towards the left, right, far right, does not matter. And he's not all just shouting either. At the right time and place, he knows when to dial it back a bit, put a perennial smile on his face, and talk to you in a calm, friendly fashion. And talking about, well, talking. Kamiya is a great storyteller. When it comes to Japanese politicians, especially the ones in the high-ranked positions, they are known to be a rather elite group. Most of them come from legacy political families, such as Shinzo Abe, a former Japanese prime minister whose grandfather was the literal prime minister of Japan himself, as well as his father being the former minister for foreign affairs of Japan. Or how about Ishiba Shigeru, the current prime minister of Japan? His father was the longtime governor of Tottori Prefecture and the former minister for home affairs. But for Kamiya Sōhei, such was not the case at all. His parents were not politicians. They were not diplomats. They ran a small local supermarket in his hometown of Takayama. So when it comes to connecting with the average Japanese voter, Kamiya has something most establishment politicians do not. A personal story that actually sounds personal. When it comes to how the typical Japanese politician appeals to the general Japanese public, they indeed rarely do get personal. Because, I mean, what is there to say, right? For the current Prime Minister Ishiba, his story would be something like, yeah, my father was the governor of a prefecture for more than a decade. I attended Keio High School, then attended the prestigious Keio University. And as his personal story continues, it will stray further and further away from the typical experiences that are lived by the everyday Japanese citizen throughout his or her lifetime. But Kamiya came from a working class family and is never afraid to share his personal story with his supporters. Why he got interested in pursuing politics, how he backpacked across 18 different countries, etc. And the more of himself he shared, the more it resonated with many of the citizens of Japan. It gave people a sense that he's not one of them, the elites. He's one of us. Now, let's be honest, when considering all aspects of the life story of Kamiya Sōhei, he may not exactly come across as the brightest one out of the room. There's no denying the fact that he's extremely charismatic and understands the art of storytelling. But when it comes to just raw administrative competence or intellectual pedigree, I mean, we're speaking with all due respect here, but the record does speak for itself. He did not have the administrative knowledge and acumen, or at least be able to learn it in fast enough time to successfully operate the local supermarket. We know for a fact that he failed at passing the national bar exam a number of times, despite studying for it for years. And there is indeed a voice that questions his intellectual capability and whether he will actually be able to carry out all of the complex economic policies that he is currently promising to the Japanese public if he does eventually get into a position of more political power. But then, when it comes to understanding the art of political positioning, reading the political landscape, and knowing where exactly the votes are at, he is indeed smart, or at least clearly knows what he's doing. To elaborate, ever since the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was assassinated in 2022, there's been a growing perception, especially among conservatives, that the Liberal Democratic Party, traditionally Japan's dominant right-wing force, has been gradually shifting more center-left regarding many of its policies and general party direction under the Kishida and Ishiba administration. This meant that a significant portion of the LDP's conservative base were thoroughly discontent with the overall path of where the party was heading and were seeking for a new political party to support. Kamiya saw that void and astutely stepped right in. And it was not just the former LDP supporters who were drawn to Kamiya and the promises made by his party. A significant portion of support came from previously disengaged non-voters, particularly among the younger generation aged between 20 to 40. These were people who had grown deeply fed up with Japan's entire political establishment, which many felt was dominated by the out-of-touch elderly elites. If you spend even a few moments browsing through the Japanese side of the internet, you'll soon find that there are countless comments written by the Japanese people expressing their sentiments in the lines of how it is not that they are in large support of Kamiya and his political party, but that they just want the corrupt LDP to finally collapse, or more realistically, wane in his power and influence. And if we are to continue talking about what Kamiya has done right regarding reading the political landscape and being able to identify, then deliver the message that the Japanese people want to hear, we could just go on and on and on. How he proposed stricter immigration policy measures and succeeded in effectively targeting the anti-foreigner, especially the anti-China sentiment that has progressively grown in Japan during the recent phase, due to reasons such as their buying up of houses and property in Japan and subsequently raising the housing prices, running illegal Airbnb establishments across the nation, taking advantage of Japan's health insurance system while largely evading payment, just to name a few. His undeniably enticing promises regarding economic policy, such as how he'll provide 100,000 yen per month for families with children between the age of 0 to 15. Just a massive, direct financial appeal to the struggling middle and working class of Japan. And all of this ultimately funnels into one overarching slogan, Japanese first. How he wants to recreate Japan with the people with the Japanese first mindset.
私がやりたいことは日本人ファースト会でやりたいことは日本を作り直したいんです。皆さんと一緒に。
A Japan that prioritizes its own citizens, and at a time when many people in Japan are feeling economically worse off with rising inflation, stagnant wages, and an inundation of foreign tourists crowding up public spaces and snapping up property within the island nation, while they themselves can barely afford to get by, let alone travel abroad. You start to see the brilliance in Kamiya's political strategy. He may not have a background from a political dynasty such as Shinzo Abe, but in our opinion, he has something just as powerful, especially in today's global political landscape: populist instinct, a raw emotional intelligence when it comes to knowing exactly what to say, when to say it, not to mention how to say it, with his masculine charisma to hit just the right emotional notes in the hearts of the Japanese public. Nevertheless, Kamiya Sōhei has faced his fair share of criticism that contributes to his status as one of the most polarizing figures in Japanese politics today. There's a whole myriad of criticisms that we could dive into, but for the sake of brevity, let's just examine the most prominent ones, beginning with one of the most tragic and well-documented cases, the alleged power harassment that ended in a devastating loss. In December 2023, Kamiya's former official secretary, Hiraoka Yukari, made the tragic decision on her own life. This was largely caused by Kamiya's power harassment against her since she first took on her job in 2022. The verbal abuse is said to have been the most severe from the end of 2022 to the beginning of 2023, which deteriorated her health so badly that she reportedly lost her ability to speak properly and lived in a near constant state of trembling. In a message she sent to an acquaintance before her passing, she wrote, "Does he think that he can get away with saying anything, no matter how abusive it is? Of course, none of my superiors at the workplaces I worked in the past were like this, and I was respected as a subordinate." When reporters from Bunshun began looking into this case, they were able to identify the fact that Kamiya's verbal abuse against his secretary was already widely known among both the Sansei-to party members and outside associates. And with all of such existing evidence, Kamiya admitted to the fact that he did conduct the verbal abuse against Hiraoka and said that he felt a sense of responsibility for her death. Hiraoka was a single mother with a daughter who was now attending university. And as a son who was raised by a single mother myself, I know how hard it must have been for her to work a professional career in Japan with bosses who are unafraid to use their position of power to make your life a living hell. And now that her daughter has successfully become an independent adult, it could be likely that Hiraoka felt that she could finally let things go. May she rest in peace. And this case informs of the fact that behind the permanent smile that Kamiya puts on during the public interviews, he may not be the all-good, he can do no wrong type of leader that many of his most fervent followers may think that he is. As much as many in Japan attempt their best to not label Kamiya and his party as far-right, the revisionist tendencies that he demonstrates, especially around Japan's wartime past, are, with all due respect, the most quintessential textbook examples of what the Japanese far-right establishment have been doing for decades. So let's go over just a few examples of the controversies surrounding Kamiya's version of Japanese history. In May 2025, during a campaign speech, Kamiya claimed that during the Battle of Okinawa, local civilians were only killed by US forces and not by the Imperial Japanese Army. To the local Okinawans who have lost their loved ones from the war, or anyone familiar with the history of Okinawa, the statement was not just wrong, it was profoundly offensive. The factual truth is, many Okinawan civilians were indeed killed by the Japanese military during the Pacific War. At the time, the Imperial Army operated under a ruthless policy. Any civilian suspected of being a spy, even without evidence, could be executed on the spot. This means that thousands of Okinawans died not just from US air raids and shelling, but from forced asides, executions, and abandonment by their own military. Professor Ishihara Masaie from Okinawa International University, a scholar of Okinawan history, swiftly responded, publicly condemning Kamiya's remarks. He cited verified historical documents and testimonies and urged Kamiya not to distort history for political gain. And he was not alone. The Okinawa Prefectural Assembly passed an official resolution condemning Kamiya's comments, stating that he twisted and denied the real facts of what Okinawans had endured. Furthermore, back in April 2025, Kamiya had submitted a formal inquiry to the Japanese government. And in it, he echoed nearly every cliché of Japan's traditional far-right historical revisionism, how Japan should not be apologizing for what they have committed during World War II, as such actions will bring Japan backwards and stems from the masochistic view of history that was installed by the WGIP, or War Guild Information Program, of the Allied powers. He's essentially saying that the West is guilt-tripping Japan for historical events that has already been said and done. This whole letter written by Kamiya is, quite frankly, a historical farce that makes you wonder if he was smoking something while writing this. How Japan actually contributed to the international community through World War II, such as providing an opportunity for independence of many colonies, and how Japan's little colonies of the past, such as Korea and Taiwan, should be thankful for the infrastructure development that Japan has done for them prior to and during World War II, and how South Korea has to stop with the comfort women nonsense. Our subscribers already know this, but for many who may be new to our channel, I come from a rather unique, or at least a relatively uncommon background. I'm a South Korean who was born and raised in Seoul, but then moved over to Tokyo for university, leading me to work in Japan post-graduation and have stayed ever since. I consider myself probably one of the best, or at least most balanced individual to discuss historical matters between Japan and South Korea. I am neither a Japan detractor whom you often see in South Korea. Such people in South Korea have never left the country in their entire lives, are just a bitter group of people in general and have a narrow perception of the world. Coming from a single-parent household and having had no idea of how I was to pay for all of the university tuition, Waseda University, the Japanese government, and their JASO scholarship program essentially saved my life and helped build a life that I have now. So in that sense, I'll be forever grateful to Japan and know for a fact, after living more than a decade of my life here, that most people in Japan are good, kind people. But at the same time, I'm a South Korean whose grandmother and grandfather have anecdotally told me about all of the atrocities that the Japanese soldiers have done onto the Korean civilians during the war. So when someone like Kamiya, or again, the traditional Japanese far-right wingers for the longest of time, make all these inhumane claims, such as how people need to just forget, or STFU about Japanese soldiers conducting SA and sadistically killing millions of innocent civilians during the war, because Japan helped Korea build roads and infrastructure. Come on now. And Kamiya states that the reason why Japan should not apologize and not admit to the wrongdoing committed during the war is because such masochistic view of history prevents Japan from being proud about their history and their national identity. We have to resoundingly disagree with this. Germans properly apologized for their conduct during World War II, as in genuinely apologized, and teaches history properly to its upcoming generation without the revisionist tendencies of the Japanese textbooks. Does this mean that the Germans are not proud of their history and their identity as German people? Not at all. A nation can still admit to the mistakes, maturely confront their darkest past, vouch to never let it happen again, and still feel great pride about its national identity. Because moral clarity and pride does not come from denial, they come from mature accountability. This is the right way forward for Japan, not the contents that you see in Kamiya's letter. One of the biggest criticisms levied against Kamiya Sōhei, especially by the Western media or by his domestic critics within Japan, is that he's a xenophobe and a racist, that he wants to kick all foreigners out of Japan and sees non-Japanese people as inherently lesser beings. Now, once he is labeled as such, his supporters are quick to defend him. They argue that Kamiya is none of those things, and that he merely wants to protect Japanese culture and sovereignty through implementing stricter immigration policies. And on this point, we actually have to partly agree with his supporters. Kamiya never downright claims that he feels antipathy towards all foreigners or state that no foreigners should come to Japan. And if we are to head over to Sanseito's official website and read the actual policy proposals, it is indeed stated that the party still understands the necessity of immigration when it comes to highly skilled labor. What they oppose is the influx of unskilled workers and what they see as the negative consequences of rapid, unregulated immigration. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the fact that there is evidence, uncomfortable, troubling evidence, that suggests Kamiya does harbor a degree of xenophobic or even racist tendencies. Take for example of what happened during a street campaign on July 18th, 2025 in Yokkaichi, Mie Prefecture. In front of supporters, cameras, and a crowd of voters, Kamiya said, word for word, "We are being derided by the critics who say that we don't know this, we don't know that we don't know the Constitution, that we're stupid, we're idiots, we're chon."
それをね、あれが足りない、これが足りない、憲法分かってない、アホだ、バカだ、チョンだと。
Now, we need to pause here and first explain on what the word chon actually means. Chon is an extremely derogatory racial slur used in Japan to describe Koreans. As in, there is already a highly offensive Japanese word to describe the people of Korea, such as Chosenjin, but chon is a word that takes the racial hatred a step further. If calling a Korean person Chosenjin is like calling an African American person, we're not going to say the word, but we'll have it on screen right now. Or a Japanese person. Using the word chon is like saying, again, please have a look at the words on screen. Even Kamiya immediately knew that he had crossed the line with this Freudian slip. Right after saying it, he laughed nervously and said, "I shouldn't say chon, sorry, let's cut that part out. Ah, I said it again." But here's the part that really matters. It's when he said, "Ah, I said it again." Because that one phrase says a lot. To his supporters, who's willing to defend him to the moon, it might seem like a harmless, awkward joke, a slip of the tongue, nothing more. But for the rest, this is an alarming sign. The fact that he admits to how he said chon more than once, despite his repeated efforts to control himself not to do so, shows exactly what repeated Freudian slips often tend to reveal: one's subconscious feelings. And if he cannot control himself from simply not saying the most racist of words, even in the most formal setting, you can only imagine the type of thoughts that are running unfettered within his brain, or his vocabulary used in private settings when the cameras are off. Perhaps this event was a small, yet a sharp window for us to understand just why his former secretary tragically chose to take her own life, when all that was committed to her by Kamiya was that of a mere verbal abuse. Now look, if we were to dive deep into every criticism and controversy surrounding Kamiya Sōhei and Sansei, we'd be here for hours. This could easily be a 2-hour video, but for the sake of brevity and your time, we'll now go through the rest of the major controversies rapid fire. Let's get into it. The criticisms against this party's draft constitution, which many constitutional academics in Japan rebuke for only emphasizing the sovereignty of the state. How he promotes, either directly or through subtle nuance, of how women should strive and be proud to just stay home, have kids, and be good mothers in almost every chance he gets. Putting attention into women's rights in the workplace or gender equality in modern society is just not something that Kamiya is concerned about. For Kamiya, his overarching undertone regarding women in the workforce has always been a one in the lines of, if you've gotta work, well, then I guess you've gotta do what you've gotta do. But don't be bringing all this gender equality nonsense, and know that you'll be better off being a mother raising kids at home. His heavy anti-LGBTQ stance, although I'm admittedly not fond at all of the extreme ideas, such as once male transgender athletes being freely allowed to compete in female sports, the type of loaded anti-LGBTQ statements that Kamiya often makes is also more than worrying. For instance, in a street speech in 2023, Kamiya literally said, to quote, "Diversity, political correctness, and gender equality are communism." The lies, from big to small. He always criticizes many carb sources that are non-rice, such as wheat, how it leads to cancer and all that, but then is caught eating pizza, claiming that he has never seen giant snails being farmed, but them being found by online detectives of him literally visiting and inspecting a giant snail farm a few years prior in 2015. Talking about how all we need is an optimized immune system and that we do not need chemicals such as medicine and vaccines in our bodies, while being found of unapologetically receiving IV drips or, God forbid, flu vaccinations, the very evil that he condemned. And there's just way too many examples of him saying a certain thing, only to turn out that he does or did something that goes diametrically against what he said. Again, none of this is criminal, but it does highlight a pattern. And of course, one of the biggest and most persistent point brought up by his critics, how he's way too cult-like with all the rhetoric regarding ancestors, spirituality, etc., conducting fear-mongering claims such as how importing foreign rice to Japan will lead to a slow ethnic cleansing. Yes, he really did say this, and much more that makes you question whether he wants to be the future Prime Minister of Japan or the leader of a cult supported by devout followers at the core. So what are our final thoughts on Kamiya Sōhei? Who is he, really? We believe that the answer lies somewhere in the middle of two very opposite extremes, as with where the answer lies with most things in life. Take optimal muscle growth, for instance. Extreme overtraining can lead to joint deterioration, weakening of the immune system, muscle tears, reducing the secretion of the right hormones, and messing up your physiology, and it's just not the right answer for optimal muscle growth. But on the opposite end of the spectrum of being completely sedentary and never working out, also by far from being the right answer for optimal muscle growth. The answer for optimal muscle growth lies somewhere around the middle of the two extremes of the rich piano-style fanatical overtraining and inexorable resting in bed. I'm terrible with analogies today, but at the same time, this is the approach that we have to take in order to procure the most accurate answer on who Kamiya Sōhei really is. He is, in all likelihood, not the ultra-nationalistic, rabid far-right figure that many Western media outlets or his domestic detractors portray him out to be. Here's the brutal truth that many of his most fervent supporters may not want to hear. Throughout our research, we've came across Kamiya conducting this confession. A confession that could, depending on how you look at it, quietly undermine the very foundation of his public persona. the now infamous slogan that helped propel him into national, not to mention international spotlight, Japanese first, was not even originally his or his party's idea. It was arguably the most populist maneuver a politician could make. His other party members conducted a public survey, and the slogan, Japanese First, received the most amount of popular support from the Japanese people. And in a rather candid moment, Kamiya admitted that after the House of Councillors election, he will no longer be using the Japanese First slogan. And he said this in a way that made him sound rather embarrassed about what should be his party's proud slogan.
日本人ファーストという言葉は差別や排外主義を煽ることになっているのではないでしょうか。
はい、そうは思っていないので、はい、引き続きそれはないようにしていきたいと思いますし、これ選挙のキャッチコピーですから、はい、選挙の間だけなので、はい、終わったらそんなことで、差別を助長するようなことはしませんし。
So does this mean that he's merely a moderate conservative who just happens to have good opportunistic instincts, that is also thinking too far in the extreme? The letter that Kamiya sent to the Japanese government, the shameless speech disregarding the death of Okinawan civilians during World War II, his nationalistic, conspiracy-ridden blog posts that goes way back to more than a decade, the racist Freudian slips, and a secretary taking away her own life following his prolonged verbal abuse. These are something that cannot merely be faked just in order to take advantage of the nation's political swing. They are reflections of something more deeply rooted. So while Kamiya is most likely not the frothing far-right leader that some claim him to be, and even possesses certain admirable characteristics such as his relentless energy, oozing charisma, and the ability to captivate a crowd, neither should he be mistaken for some temperate, objective voice of reason which a number of his ardent supporters zealously argue is the case. Now, whether he proves to be a force of progress or regression for Japan remains to be seen. Only time can deliver that verdict. But one thing is more than clear. With the continued erosion of public trust in Japan's ruling LDP that has dominated the nation's post-war political scene, and a new political epoch perhaps just beyond the horizon for Japan, Kamiya Sōhei is not some transient figure. He is here to stay and will play a pivotal role in shaping, provoking, and defining the political discourse of Japan for years, if not decades, to come.